The Monkey's Paw by W. W. Jacobs. Literary analysis. In this video, we will talk about the conflicts and the characters of the story, the point of view, mood, and tone, the suspense techniques used by W. W. Jacobs, the types of irony in the story, foreshadowing, and lasting the scene. First thing, the conflict. Let's bear in mind that all types of conflicts are present in the story The Monkey's Paw. We have external conflict, character versus character, character versus supernatural powers, versus fate, versus technology, versus society, in addition to internal conflict. So again, we have all types of conflicts in the story The Monkey's Paw. Now you're required to pause the video here, read some examples of the conflicts, then proceed with the video. Now let's talk about the characters. Let's discuss some of the character traits or descriptions of Mr. White and Mrs. White. Mr. White is an old man who was very curious about the paw, which brought all misfortune to his family members. He thinks longingly about the far lands he has never visited. The paw fascinates him because of its connection to those lands. Although it is Mr. White who makes all three wishes, he makes the first two only at the suggestions of his son. He felt so much sorrow for his son's death and wished his son back to life under his wife's influence. What about Mrs. White? Mrs. White is very irrational and reckless, as she forced her husband to wish their son back to life regardless of all consequences. Now let's talk about a very important character in the story, which is Sergeant Major Morris. Sergeant Major Morris is a friend of the White's family. He enjoys talking about his adventures overseas and shows the White's family his monkey's paw, in spite of his reservations about it. He discourages Mr. White from dreaming of India, suggesting that life is much better at home in England. He throws the monkey's paw into the fire and urges Mr. White to not make any kind of wishes, but he ultimately tells him exactly how to make a wish. Now it's the time to talk about the poor Herbert, Mr. and Mrs. White's son. He's the only one of the Whites, and he works in a company called Now and Megan's. He's greedy as he wished for money that cost his life. Now we're going to discuss the point of view, the mood, and the tone of the story. What is the point of view of the story? What's the way the story is being told or narrated? The story is told from third person limited. Why third person limited? Because we only get to know the thoughts and feelings of Mr. White. Let's move on to the mood. What is meant by the mood, in case you do not remember? Mood means the feeling of the reader while reading a story, or the feeling of the audience while watching a movie. So how can we describe the mood in the very beginning of the story, at the exposition and the rising action? We can describe the mood as being suspenseful, eerie, or even creepy. What about the middle? In the middle of the story, the mood can be described as despair, grief, guilt, and horror. What about the end, or at the resolution of the story? It can be described as dark, horror, or even mysterious. As we know that The Monkey's Paw is a horror suspenseful story. But the question now is, how was W. W. Jacobs able to create suspense in the story? He was able to make the story suspenseful and thrilling through the usage of different suspense techniques, like the description of the time, the description of the place, the dialogue or the conversation between the characters, the use of imagery, ironies, and foreshadowing. Now we're going to talk about every one of them and extract some examples from the story text. Number 1. The description of the place. The house is very isolated. The fact that it's too far away from any other buildings around the area indicates to the reader that something wrong is about to happen to them. Let's have a quote from the story. Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Now, let's talk about number 2, which is the description of the time. The story takes place in a wintry weather. As the quote says, the night was cold and wet. And at night, in the middle of nowhere, the sounds and the movements seem a lot scarier and creepy. Number 3, the dialogue or the conversation between the characters. For instance, the dialogue between Mr. White and Morris. The reader learns that the last owner of the paw wished for his own death. which creates suspense and foreshadows that something ominous might happen to the White family. Number 4, the use of imagery. And as we know, imagery means creating mental picture in the reader's mind through vivid descriptions and adjectives as well as sensory details. For example, let's read the following quotes from the story. The gate bangs loudly and there are heavy footsteps. The soldier's face turns pale when he speaks of the monkey's paw. Silence or a hush takes over the room. The piano makes a loud and crashing noise. There is a man outside making mysterious movements. Twisted in my hands like a snake. All these are some examples of images of the story. Now you're required to pause the video here, hit your textbook and search for more examples of imageries. Now let's talk about ironies. And as we know, irony means something unexpected happens or takes place in the story. The monkey's paw has all 3 types of ironies, which are situational, verbal, and dramatic. Now you're required to pause the video here, read some examples of situational irony, then you're required to refer to the textbook extract, both dramatic irony and verbal irony. Please take notice that we have only one verbal irony in the story. If you extract it right, then you understand the story perfectly. Hope grade 8 you were able to extract the 3 types of irony after referring to your textbook. Now let's talk about another suspense techniques, which is foreshadowing. What is meant by foreshadowing? Foreshadowing means anticipating future events or some hints or clues given by the author which enables me to predict future events. For instance, we have the following quotes from the story. His face whitened. This quote shows that the sergeant is disturbed by the 3 wishes previously made on the monkey's paw, which foreshadows the misfortune that could happen to the whites if they make a wish. Another example of foreshadowing says, if you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire like a sensible man. It also tells that something wrong might occur to the white family due to the paw. We have 3 more examples of foreshadowing. You're required to pause the video, refer to the textbook, and extract the 3 of them. I'll be waiting for you. Don't forget to pause the video and search for examples of foreshadowing. Finally, let's talk about the theme of the story. What did we learn from the monkey's paw and from Mr. White's family? We learned that no one can miss or challenge his fate. We also learned that to be careful for what we wish for. And greed will lead to misfortune, and we have to be satisfied with what we have. Thank you so much, grade 8, for your time. I hope you liked the story as well as the video, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.